Here comes part 2 of replacement. Actually, it'd be kind of part 3 because several weeks ago I talked about the letter of J not being in the Hebrew language or the Greek language or even in the English language for about 1,600 years. And, whose name are we saved in? And then last week we talked about replacement theology as well. Some of the history of where it began with the Samaritans. The Samaritans were the first people that taught replacement theology. Now, you may be wondering why in the world I have that picture. What is that? It's a T-bone. How many like T-bone steak? All right, but here is the problem. It goes back to perspective. If you focus only on the bone, there's a bone in here. I'm not going to eat it. There's a bone. And you narrow in on that bone and you see it and I'm not going to eat it. Oh, that's your problem. I'll take the meat around it. But that's what happens with people's perspective on theology. They reject all of Judaism because there's a bone in it. Well, guess what? There's not only bones in Judaism, there's a lot of bones in Christianity. I mean, it's almost like a carp. But, that's got a lot of bones. But so what you have to do is you have to know how to separate. There's bones everywhere, in every religion. But the key is don't focus on the bone. Okay, there's bones in Judaism, there's bones in Christianity, but what we want to look at is the meat. Okay, and there's meat in both. Let me just see if I have this in here. Okay, I don't see it in here, so I'm just going to mention it. I may have mentioned it last week. But do you remember, how many of you remember Romans 9, 10, 11? Okay, one of the things that we know from Corinthians, Paul said, we know in part, we see through a glass darkly. Well, guess what? That means we see through a glass darkly. Okay? But we only know in part. Romans 11 says the Jews were only blinded in part. So the Jews are in the same condition the Christians are in. We both see in part. Christians see through this lens, Jews see through this lens. They have a different perspective. And the first group to humble themselves and look out of the other lens gets to see the clear picture. But we have to humble ourselves. We can't say, there's a bone, there's a bone, there's a bone, there's a bone. And the other one goes, there's meat, there's meat, there's meat. But it's both sides. Both sides are looking at the bone in the other rather than the meat in the other. So let's do a quick review from last week. In 2 Kings 17:29, it says, howbeit every nation made gods of their own, put them in the houses of the high places, which the Samaritans had made, every nation of their cities wherein they had dwelt. Okay, so the Samaritans were clear back in 700 BC. The Samaritans had been around a long time, all the way up through Yeshua's time, around 30 of the current era. And if you remember, when did this happen? It's when the Assyrians captured northern Israel. They moved the Israelis to other nations. They took those from other nations and put them in Israel. And then they didn't know how to worship Israel's God. They were eaten by lions, and they go and say, please bring some of them back and teach us how to obey the God of this land. Because back then, everyone thought every country had its own God that had to be worshiped. Now, John, I don't know if you knew, he lived in Ephesus. Okay? Here we go. Here is Turkey, and that yellow line is dividing Europe from Asia. Now, many of you may have been with me this last year. We visited all 7 churches in Turkey, and then we went over to Philippi and Athens and Corinth. We visited all of those areas. Well, look at this in John 19:26 and 27. Yeshua's up on the cross. He sees John. It says, when Yeshua saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mom, woman, behold your son. And he said to the disciple, behold your mom. And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. As you know, back then, women had no rights. If they didn't have someone to take care of them, they were in trouble. Well, Yeshua put John in charge of his mother. Okay. Well, one of the things that happened is Herod Agrippa started killing all the disciples. And John said, it's time to move. And so John moved up to Ephesus. Okay, that's where he lived. And guess who he took with him? Mary, or Miriam. Here's a picture I took of Ephesus when we were there. We're in the hotel. I'm up, on the higher floor. But here's what Ephesus looks like. And right here is where we immersed about 20 people that were on the trip. And this is the same place that the Apostle Paul immersed people, and they all filled with the Holy Spirit and came out. It was a lot of fun. The Apostle John brought Miriam or Mary to Ephesus after Stephen was stoned. Okay? And James is beheaded. So this is around 37 to 48, about 7 years after Messiah died. Things are getting worse. And Herod Agrippa ruled from 41 to 44. That was the year he was ruling. This is the area where John lived. Of course, it was repaired in the 1st century, repaired again in the 4th century, repaired again in the 7th century, and then it was repaired again around 1951. Now, here's the thing. Okay, I'm going to... Now, if you guys want to take pictures, you can take pictures. I have a lot I'm going to be saying. Roman Emperor Claudius Caesar was the Roman emperor from 41 to 54. He was poisoned by his wife because she wanted her son to be emperor. So she kills her husband and makes her son emperor. After him, many of you have heard of Nero, right? Well, that was Claudius Caesar's wife's son. Nero now becomes the Roman emperor. And guess what he does? After his mother kills her husband and appoints him, he kills his mother. Okay? Then he ruled till 68 as Roman emperor. And then comes Vespasian, and he ruled from 69 to 79. The year between 68 and 69 had like 3 Roman emperors who kept killing each other, trying to be the boss. And so then came Vespasian, and from 69 to 79, the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, if you remember. Well, Vespasian had a son named Titus, and he was the next emperor from 79 to 81. So this is all of the 1st century. Who was the king of Judea? Okay, Herod Agrippa the First was appointed by Claudius Caesar in the year 41. The same year he became emperor, he appointed Herod Agrippa, who you read in your Bible was from 41 to 44. He's the one who beheads John's brother James, which is why John decided it's time to move to Ephesus. His brother just got beheaded by this guy. So he moves. King Agrippa is the one who imprisons Peter. John ends up moving to Ephesus, and Herod Agrippa is the one who's in Caesarea who dies and all the worms eat him, it talks about. Okay? Well, now here comes Nero, and he's the one who ordered the death of his mother. Well, he began his rule at only 16 years old. And he died by suicide at 30 years old in the year 68, which is when and Rome burns to the ground in 64 CE, and that's when they say he played the fiddle while Rome burned. That's debatable if that's really happened. But he's the Roman emperor who killed his mother. He was only 16 years old. And then after Rome was burned to the ground, 4 years later, he ends up committing suicide at 30 years old. But the thing is, he is the one, in 64 BC, when Rome burnt to the ground, all the believers were the ones that were blamed, that Rome burned. Okay, so now they're getting the heck out of there. So the Messianic Jews fled in 67 to Pella. Okay, that's in the Jordan area up north. It's not Petra, it's Pella. And they go north. Jerusalem, we know, was destroyed in 70 CE. And the reason the Messianic Jews fled, it says in the Gospels, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by the armies, get the heck out of there. So that's what they did 3 years before Jerusalem was destroyed. They left. And this was part of the problem, was that when the Jews were fighting the Romans, they wanted the Messianic Jews to help. And they said, we're out of here. And so that's where some of the obstinacy against each other came, because the Orthodox Jews didn't like the Messianic Jews fleeing during the war. And they say basically on the 9th of Av or whatever, in 70, when the temple was destroyed, there were 1,200,000 Jews died. 1,200,000 Jews were laying dead all around Jerusalem. And so the rest of the Jews, what do? We're out of here. Everybody's getting killed by the Romans. So here they're all fleeing the synagogues, but they're not going after the Gentile believers. And so now the Gentile believers get to move into the synagogues and say, we're the boss. Okay, so Herod, let me see where I'm at. Okay, Agrippa was appointed to his monarchy by Emperor Claudius in 41, but a proud Jew he claimed to be as well. He was a very popular figure among the Jews in Judea. The Orthodox Jews in Judea loved Herod Agrippa because he was getting rid of the Messianic Jews. In Acts 12, 1 through 3, it says, about that time, Herod, the king, laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. And look, this happened during Passover. That's when this is happening. Well, Herod Agrippa was the grandson of Herod the Great. One of his wives was Miriam, one of the Maccabees. She was a princess from the line of the Maccabees. Well, it was that Agrippa who was even born, they felt, was a miracle in itself. Why? Because Herod the Great murdered his wife, Miriam, and most of her family because he felt that these Maccabees posed a threat to the descendants of Esau, and Herod the Great, is from Edom or Esau. As a matter of fact, Caesar Augustus once made this comment. He said, I would rather be Herod's pig than his son. Because he eats kosher, he won't kill the pig, but he'll kill his own son. Okay, Agrippa managed to survive despite the cruelty of his grandfather, Herod the Great. Now, let me see where I'm at. Okay, let's look at this. In 2 Timothy 4:22, it says, this is the second epistle to Timothy, who was ordained the first bishop of the church of Ephesus, or the Ephesians. Okay, so in Ephesus, we see the first bishop was Timothy. And this is written from Rome when Paul was brought before who? Nero. Okay, so I'm trying to give you a time frame of when all this is going on. The information that we know about John's exile to Patmos, remember John was exiled to Patmos? How long was he there? He was only there like 2 years. And then he got to go back to Ephesus and take care of Mary. All right, I don't know if you knew that, but we're going to go into that. The information we know about John comes from Polycarp. Who has heard of Polycarp? Who has never heard of Polycarp? And who has no idea if they know or not know? I never saw some hands. Okay. Polycarp, this is important. Polycarp knew the Apostle John like I know you, personally. And here's what happened. Let me go here. Okay, you see Titus was 79 to 81, just a few years, and that was Vespasian's son. Well, what happened here in 79 to 81 BC, the non-Jewish believers began to take over leadership, and they had no knowledge of Torah or the Hebrew language. And Greek philosophy is their moral base. And this is why they're taking over the synagogue, as I quoted last week in 1 John 1:9, when Diotrephes was rejecting every Jew who came to the synagogue. He rejected the apostles, and he rejected any Gentiles who wanted the Jews there. So this is what is happening. This is after the destruction of the temple, okay? 10 years after. So the year of 4 emperors is when Nero commits suicide, and he's succeeded by Galba, Otho, and Vitellius, who is succeeded by General Vespasian. And Vespasian is named emperor by the Roman Senate. All these guys were like generals killing each other. And then the Senate picks Vespasian. All right? So now, I want to see where I'm at. Here we go. So the Roman emperor, if you remember, was Claudius Caesar, Nero, Vespasian, Titus. Who comes after Titus? Domitian. And Domitian was Vespasian's other son, who was Titus's brother. All right? And he rules in the 1st century from 81 to 96. He's followed by Nerva, who is from 96 to 98, because Nerva murders Domitian, the Roman emperor. And then he had an adopted son named Trajan, and so he went from 98 to 117. So what I'm trying to do is just kind of give you an idea of the Roman emperors, what's going on historically. We just read about the first bishop of Ephesus. Who is the first bishop of Rome? Well, 81 to 96. It was Domitian who exiled John to Patmos in the year 95. At Patmos, he pens the book of Revelations, but that's when he also appoints Polycarp, who's only 26 years old, to be the bishop of Smyrna. Well, from 88 to 97, at the same time he is the bishop of Smyrna, Clement is called the bishop of Rome. Now, the Catholics like to call him Pope, but he wasn't the Pope. He was a bishop like all the other bishops that were leading other cities. Well, what happens when Nerva becomes Roman emperor in 96, he releases John from Patmos, and then he returns to Ephesus, and that's when he pens the Gospel of John and 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And then what happens? The next bishop of Rome is Evaristus. And he was from 97 to 105. But Polycarp is the bishop of Smyrna for a long time. So he is still bishop. Now, one thing I want to point out here. Here's Turkey. And these are the 7 churches we visited last year. And so we just found that Polycarp is the bishop of Smyrna. In a little bit, we're going to see his disciple Polycrate is the next bishop of Ephesus after Timothy. All right? Now, do you see how close Ephesus is to Smyrna? It's a few miles is all it is. Okay, now that you have memorized all of that, Smyrna was only like 35 miles from Ephesus. One of the things about ancient Smyrna, it was very involved in emperor worship. And John is the one who appointed Polycarp to be the bishop of Smyrna. Now, there was a Roman historian who lived at this time in the 1st century. He lived from the year 56 to the year 118. His name was Tacitus. And he was active throughout the reign of Trajan that we just mentioned, and in the early years of Hadrian. Let me see right here. Okay. Do you see Trajan down there from 98 to 117? This historian is active during this time. Okay, so now we're back over to here. Okay, let me see. And here's Hadrian. After him, we have the Roman Emperor Hadrian, who was from 117 to 138. He was followed by Antonius Pius from 138 to 161, who was followed by Marcus Aurelius. Everyone heard of him, I'm sure. 161 to 180, and then after him came Commodus, 180 to 192. So I just went to the 1st and 2nd century. Who are the Roman emperors, minus those bunch that came in and all killed each other within a year? All right, so the Bishop of Rome, we're going to come to that in just a minute. But first, what I want to talk about is what I have over here where Polycarp is around. Polycarp was born the year before the temple was destroyed in the year 69. He was martyred on February 23rd of the year 155, and he was 86 years old when he was martyred. Written about 156 BC, within a year of the event that he was martyred, there is an authentic eyewitness report of his heroic death by the believers who were in Smyrna, who wrote it up as a letter, and it circulated to all of the congregations. Now, let me go here and here. Let me see. There was a controversy between Polycarp, who was the bishop of Smyrna, and Anicetus, who was the bishop of Rome. Here, I'm going to have to take Polycarp was the bishop of Smyrna for like 60 years, from 95 to 155. Now, separate the East from the West, Asia from Europe. So, when Hadrian was the Roman emperor, it was Telesphorus who was the bishop of Rome. And the Catholic Church lists all these guys if you go to the history of the popes. Okay, now here's what I want to show you here. Polycarp becomes the bishop of Ephesus from 150 to 190. He was born in 150, died in 196. But in 190, he writes a letter. But I want to start with Polycarp. After Telesphorus came Pius from 140 to 155, then Anicetus from 155 to 166. And I want you to notice when Anicetus came in the year 155, Polycarp was still alive, and he is the bishop of Smyrna. Now, Smyrna and Rome, Polycarp, who's a disciple of John, has a clash with Anicetus, who's the bishop of Rome. Okay, the Pope, as far as the Catholic Church is concerned. Well, guess what? Polycarp knows John personally and knew him until John died. There's a close relationship. Okay, so, a controversy came between Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, and Anicetus, the bishop of Rome, and it was over the dating of Passover or Easter that occurred around 155. Polycarp defended keeping the Passover against the Roman bishop Anicetus, whose desire was to see the Passover replaced by another festival called Easter. So what I want you to catch, most people think this goes back to the 300s with Constantine. No. It goes back a couple hundred years earlier between Polycarp and Anicetus. Polycarp remained faithful to Nisan 14 for Passover. Adamant, the Apostle John taught him this truth about Passover observance, not Easter. Well, Polycarp became the bishop over Ephesus. And, of course, the bishop of Rome then was Victor, as you see at the very bottom. There's Victor from 189 to 199. So here we have Polycarp and Polycrates arguing against Anicetus and Victor in the 2nd century. Well, it so happens the discussion began to denigrate in anger. Victor excommunicates Polycrates and all those who followed him. So this was more of a heated controversy between Polycarp, the bishop of Ephesus, and Victor, the bishop of Rome. And the discussion began to degenerate. And so he gets communicated. And then guess what? All the parishes of Asia remained faithful to the biblical calendar heralding that the 14th day of the month at which the Jews were commanded to sacrifice their lamb should be observed as the feast of the Savior's Passover. This comes from Eusebius. Wow. So for ages, everyone on the east said, no, we're to keep Passover. It was everyone on the west, Europe and Rome, that said, no, we're going to do Easter. Okay. To their credit, all the bishops of Asia, led by Polycarp, stood their ground and were not about to compromise on this biblical truth. And Polycarp insisted we ought to obey God rather than man. And it was time to write a letter to Pope Victor. And he says, we observe the exact day, Nisan 14, for Passover. We don't add or take away, was the first line of the letter. A reminder to the Pope that the Passover date can't be changed by humans. And then he went on and he said, in Asia, there are great lights who have fallen asleep, which will rise again on the day of the Lord's coming, when he shall come with glory from heaven and will seek out all the saints. This letter continued. Unlike some of our preachers today, these men of God knew these saints were not in heaven, but awaiting the resurrected saints. Despite their differences, Bishop Victor excommunicated from the church Polycarp, even all the bishops of the other 7 churches in Asia. However, the bishop ended up reversing his decision later on after several bishops, including Irenaeus. I don't know if you ever heard of Irenaeus, one of the early church fathers. They intervened. Okay, so let me make sure I got everything. Yes, Easter or Passover? Are we going to follow the Easter bunny or the Lord? Okay, so here we go. Western Europe. Here's Rome, Europe, and they're battling the east, the 7 assemblies. Here's Jerusalem. These came long before here. All right? Now, how many of you know John, who was around in 90 AD? How come he didn't write a letter addressing the church in Rome? If it's supposed to be the big cheese, how come he only addresses the 7 churches in Asia? He doesn't address the church in Rome because he doesn't recognize Roman authority. As a matter of fact, when we were there, we went to a place that recognized Polycarp there in Smyrna, because he was the bishop of Smyrna. Here is ancient Smyrna. Today it's known as Izmir, and it was the city of the goddess Athenia. Okay, now I want to tell you real quick something about Polycarp. The tensions were already building up throughout the empire as Christians were rejecting the gods and goddesses that everyone else was worshiping. The pagans, get a load of this. Now, did all the pagans worship pagan gods? All the pagans worship pagan gods. They thought the god of every nation was some pagan god. The pagans were calling the believers atheists. Just like the word gay has changed meanings. You know, a lot of woke has changed meanings. Okay? Well, guess what? Atheist was the word put on the believers because they didn't believe in any of the pagan gods. So the believers were the atheists. Now, as Polycarp made clear, now Polycarp is John's disciple who's sticking to the biblical calendar. Polycarp made clear to the Roman government official the real atheists are those who don't worship the one true God. As the story opens, some of Smyrna's believers have already been put to death, and search parties have been looking for Polycarp, the bishop, who had been persuaded to do the prudent thing and run. Okay? Someone just tipped off the pursuers, though, that Polycarp was hiding out at a farmhouse in the country. The mounted police set out on a Friday about supper time, which is Shabbat. And they carried their usual weapons as if they were advancing against some bandit. Late in the evening, they arrived to arrest Polycarp and found out he was just resting upstairs. He could have escaped to another place, but he decided to stay, saying, God's will be done. When Polycarp heard that the police were there, he went downstairs and greeted them. Everyone was amazed at his age, being 86 years old, had the courage and wondered why there would be so much haste about arresting some 86-year-old man. Despite the lateness of the hour, he had a table even set for them to come and eat and drink. as much as they desired. He asked them to give him an hour to pray undisturbed, and they said, sure. So Polycarp stood and prayed out loud. He was so filled with the grace of God that for 2 whole hours he was praying out loud. Those who listened were astounded, and many were sorry that they'd even come to arrest such a nice old man. When Polycarp had finished his prayer, after remembering everyone who had ever crossed his path, both small and great, high and low, the time came for him to leave, and they set him on a donkey and led him out of the city. Save yourself! The chief of police, who happened to be named Herod, and his father, Nicetas, met Polycarp there and took him into their carriage. Sitting beside him, they tried to persuade him to change his mind. What harm is there in saying, Lord Caesar, and offering sacrifice and saving yourself from death? At first, Polycarp didn't answer him, but when they kept at it, he said, I'm not going to do what you advise. Then they gave up trying to persuade him and began to make threats. They forced him out of the carriage so fast that he scraped his shin getting out. Without even turning around, as though he had felt nothing, Polycarp walked on quickly and was taken to the noisy stadium. As he entered, a voice from heaven came to him, be strong, Kazakh, and act like a man. No one saw who spoke, but our friends who were there heard the voice. Polycarp was brought before the proconsul. He also tried to persuade him to deny the faith. Respect your age, he said. Swear by the divine power of Caesar. Change your mind. Say, away with the atheists, referring to the believers. But Polycarp, with a solemn look at the unruly mob in the stadium, pointed at them and looking up to heaven said, away with these atheists. The proconsul urged him harder, take the oath and I'll let you go. Just curse the Messiah. And Polycarp said, 86 years I've served him and he never did me any wrong. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? When the proconsul kept insisting, swear by the divine power of Caesar, Polycarp answered, listen plainly. I am a believer, and if you wish to learn the believer's message, arrange a meeting and give me a hearing. I'll tell you all about it. And let's see. I have wild animals, the proconsul said. I'll throw you to them unless you change your mind. Polycarp said, well, call him in. Scorn the wild beasts, he says, and I'll have you burned alive if you don't change your mind. And Polycarp said this, you threaten with fire that burns but a short time and then soon is quenched? You don't know about the fire of the coming judgment and eternal punishment that awaits the wicked, but why are you waiting? Come, do what you will. The proconsul was astonished and sent his herald into the middle of the arena 3 times to announce, Polycarp has declared that he's a believer. At the herald's announcement, the whole crowd roared with wild anger and a loud cry. This is the father of the believers, the destroyer of our gods, who teaches many to stop offering sacrifices to the gods. And shouting out with one voice, they demanded that Polycarp be burned alive. The mob hurried to gather wood and kindling from the shops and bathhouses, and when the pyre was ready, Polycarp took off his outer clothes, unfastened his belt, and even tried to take off his shoes. Immediately, they began to pile the wood around him. They were going to nail him to the stake as well, but Polycarp said, oh, leave me the way I am. He who gives me power to endure the fire will help me to remain in the flames so I won't run out, even without being secured by nails. He then said a prayer, and when he had said amen, the men in charge of the fire lit it, and a great flame blazed up, and we who were given the privilege to witness all this saw a great miracle, and we have been kept alive so that we might report to others what had happened. The fire took the shape of a vaulted room like a ship's sail filled with wind and surrounded the body of Polycarp like a wall. Seeing that his body could not be consumed by the fire, the lawless men finally commanded an executioner to go up and stab Polycarp with a dagger. Polycarp knew John well. Even after his return from Patmos in 95, he had read John's letter of Revelation. Okay? He was the bishop appointed over Smyrna. So listen to Revelation 2, 8 through 11. When it says, so then also to the angel appointed over the congregation of Smyrna, angel is the same Hebrew word for messenger. He's writing this to Polycarp. All of these 7 revelations were to the bishops over each congregation. So here Polycarp is reading, to Polycarp, appointed over the congregation of Smyrna, write this. So when you're reading these, if you want to understand the book of Revelation, you have to know who the bishop was of each one and then what transpired. And listen, it says, he's writing to Polycarp. John dies before Polycarp. And what is Polycarp reading? The first and the last, the one who is dead and has returned to life. So he knows if he dies, he's going to come back to life. And he says, say this, I know your sufferings and your poverty, even if you are really rich, and also the blasphemy of those who claim that they're Jewish, but they're not, and so become a meeting place of Satan. Don't fear what you are about to suffer. See, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison so that you'll be tried. And for 10 days you must endure tribulation, but be faithful even if you have to die for your faithfulness, and I will give to you the crown of life. And Smyrna was known as a crown because of the shape of the city. Let everyone who has ears to hear pay close attention to what the Spirit is saying to the congregation. The one who overcomes will not be hurt in any way by the second death. Well, Smyrna was called the crown city or the crown of Asia because it was surrounded by hills that resembled a crown. And what do we hear from Ephesus in 1 John 1 and 2? That which was from the first, which has come to our ears, which we have seen with our eyes, looking on it and touching it with our hands, the word of life. And the life was made clear to us. We've seen it, we're witnessing to it, and giving you word of that eternal life, which was with the Father and was seen by us. Wow, we touched him with our hands. And then what happens? In the year 324, the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Do you see Constantinople? Before it was, you have Constantinople. Well, in 324, it was called Byzantium, and it was renamed the New Rome and declared the new capital of the Roman Empire by Emperor Constantine the Great on May 11th of the year 330. It was renamed at that time to Constantinople and dedicated to Constantine. And this was followed by the decree of Constantine following the Nicene Council in the year 325. Do you see Nicaea there with a little blue dot in the middle? So what happened? Rome, the East, conquered the West, and so now Rome came up with the Nicene Creed, completely changing the history of the church at that time. But anyway, so that's just another step in the whole concept of replacement theology, and now we're going to bring it up to a little more modern day next week. I hope that helps. All right? But you can see it was clear back in the 1st century that they were already arguing over the biblical calendar. So let's stand.